You introduced me a bit before. I'm Julie Upmeyer. I was born in Michigan and I've been living in North Wales on Anglesey for about 4 years now, incredibly. But a lot has happened in that 4 years. A path that has followed my life ever since being in and graduating from art school was the idea of an artist residency. There was a book in our university library that was the Alliance of Artist Communities directory. They created a book. It was black and white, and I think it lived in my studio for almost my entire education. I don't know if there was an official checkout system, but I think I just kind of took it. So I've been fascinated for a couple decades now about the idea of artist residencies, about artist communities, about how artists can engage with a space in a time for a designated period of time. I went on to work with various residencies around the world during a very nomadic period. Sometimes I was invited as an organizer. I worked for Res Artis, the network of artist residencies, for about 10 years, being their website editor, writing a newsletter, helping to organize a lot of their conferences, which are incredible, like, nexus of global interconnectivity and creative positivity. And it was my international family for quite a large period of my life. I have helped people start residencies. I've written papers about them. I've attended them as an artist. During my 11 years in Istanbul, I ran a residency for about 5 years, hosting artists in different places. Sometimes I get invited as an artist. But at the point of being invited to this project and thinking of myself as an artist responding to the land, which I had never heard those arrangement of words associated with myself before. I mean, doing artist residencies, living in Istanbul, you think about your environment in a certain way, and that's very social, that's very built, that's very contextual. But since moving to Wales, since living in North Wales and thinking about myself as an artist involved in the land for the first time, I went back to thinking about what it meant to be an artist in residence. So the images, and whenever I'm asked to do a talk, I try to make it completely different from the last talk I've ever done about my work. So I look back on all of the artworks I've ever made and thought about, like, where I made them and why I made them, and what materials I chose to use, and why. Like, why do I consider that an artwork, and why do I consider something else that I made not an artwork? Because the designation of an artwork is also kind of something I think about a lot as well, especially during my time in Istanbul, when the definition of what an artwork was quite narrow with my community. It had to be defined in a certain way, like it had a frame, or it was in a certain space, or it was on a pedestal, or something had to kind of click in someone's head as being an art object. It couldn't just be, this cake that I made. Because I'm an artist, this is my artwork, that is a cake. Like that level of engagement with conceptual art history was not there. You had to, like, put a border on it, put a frame on it, which I did put a frame on cake, but that was actually before Istanbul. I just realized that now. Anyway, so I look back, like, way back on work that like, I wouldn't consider like a great artwork where I am now as an artist, but I can see now in thinking about my shifting definitions of what an artist in residence is, and seeing how I've started to establish my relationship with Cyd-fyw, with the land that we own, which is also a really weird idea to think about. So about 4 years ago, my husband and I purchased a 100-year-old manor house on Anglesey, which came with a pond, which came with a greenhouse, which came with a paddock, a house that had been extended upon several times, gardens, an orchard, and a 5-acre field. So that's a lot to engage with all at one time. So my artwork in the last, well, my life, and sometimes my artwork in the last few years have been things coming from trying to understand what's happening with that, with those different areas of the land, with the cycles, with the seasons, with the humidity, with the temperatures, with what grows when and where, and observing that and trying to understand that within the cycle of my family, within the cycle of my neighbors, within the cycle of my own kind of timeline as an artist and as a human being. So I looked back, and I'm a very material-based person. I like paper, I like plastic. I studied ceramics, which is very physical and very transformational. And very early in studying ceramics, I realized, we were come to realize through the program that, look, if you make something and you put that in a kiln, that will last forever. That needs to be a big decision to say, look, something that you made is going to be transformed from a water-soluble, pigmenty things into something that literally will last potentially forever. So that engagement with material and with process, even though I haven't used clay as a material in quite some time, has stuck with me. So this first piece, I was living for 3 months in Amsterdam working for an artist. These first ones, I mean, I guess they're on my website somewhere, but they're not. It was nice to go back and see what materials I gravitated towards, and then what processes I tried to put those materials through in kind of a fleeting, very temporary artist in residence, which is what a lot of artist residencies are. Like, you're there for 3 months, you're there for 1 month. Best case scenario, I mean, 3 months, some really like maybe a year. So I was in Amsterdam for 3 months, and this was a very surface level engagement with a stack of maps that I had. Oh. And I have a psychological addiction to folding paper. And it makes me feel productive and fulfills my Protestant sense of productivity. And I come back to it a lot, like, not in any way that I'm happy with as a artist necessarily, but it makes me feel deeply happy. And sometimes I do end up producing something with folded paper that I can say, oh yeah, that's a good balance of like a craft and concept, but not this necessarily. But it was very pleasing, and it felt very productive to fold, to cut and fold maps and like remap the city. This was for a different artist residency involved project, starting a residency, which didn't happen. I was living on Paros in Greece, on an island in Greece for 2 or 3 or 4 months. And I would swim every day, collect sea urchins, and then developed this way of breaking them and sealing them in wax that would kind of explode them. And this, I realized for the first time since 15 years of making this, that kind of feeds into transforming 3-dimensional objects to 2-dimensional imagery, which then can be translated back into 3 and 4 dimensions. Because you still get the idea that this is a 3-dimensional object. Boom. This is early Istanbul days. So the art space I was running ended up being right next to the central bank of Turkey. They didn't print money there, but they did shred it. And there was this very ritualistic performance every Thursday in which an armored car would come up with like helmet and guns, and they would offload these big plastic bags full of shredded money into these cars and then drive off. And some would fall on the ground. So for about 1.5 years, I collected the shreds and then reconstructed the money according to the dimensions of the actual bills. So again, like I included this in the kind of trying to pick apart what I think about artist residencies, in that this was me as a semi-temporary but more permanent person responding to a material that came up as a material of interest, and I was able to process it in a certain way that was determined by the material itself. So when I can find a material that fascinates me and find a way that's semi-dictated by the material in order to create something, those are the cycles which make me most satisfied as an artist. So the scale of this and the color of it was predetermined by the material. So that makes me really happy. That was the 10 yeah. Plus anything that meticulous just also makes me happy. 20. And this was big money, everything mixed up. I'm actually going to skip that one now. It made sense at the time when I was putting the presentation together, but it would take me off in a tangent that I don't want to go to at this point. This is right before leaving Istanbul. At this point, I had been there for 10 years. For the summers, I was living on an island in a shack place. I mean, there was a sink and a bathroom, but mostly it was very different from the very urban atmosphere of Istanbul. And there was a group of artists as part of this exhibition that was responding to one of the islands in the archipelago that had sunken. So you could go to it, but it was just below the surface. And this was the first time that I had engaged with the landscape of Istanbul rather than a material that popped out within the hardware district of my studio. So this was something of the structure of the land rather than the current history of the people's engagement with it. So I've been reading a lot about camouflage, and I'd done some other projects with dazzle camouflage, and I still really love that. So I had devised a way that the island itself could be hidden, so that the island could defend itself against potential drainage or population, like reestablishing itself on it, because it had sunk, I forget the year now, but a long time ago it had sunk. So this was my proposal for the island, that it could form these sea defenses out of its own being. And then this was the proper arrangement that if the waves come, because you detect movement and beings and islands and land masses and boats at sea through the waves. So this was a wave break. And if the island were to make this out of its own seashells and seaweed and things in this formation, you wouldn't be able to find it. So the oncoming waves would be spiraled and turned back upon itself, in that you wouldn't, the island wouldn't reveal itself through the movement of the waves. Okay, yeah, that's kind of fits in what I'm saying. This was another one where I was starting to think about the relationship between the living things in the environment. So that was like giving an island a voice and a means of interaction and defense. This was a piece called the Metamorphic Varieties, in which I proposed that over time, animals dwelling within an urban environment would evolve in order to camouflage themselves within a built world. So that cats and rabbits and birds would evolve over some amount of time in order to live within cities, even if the humans were to leave, like the built environment still remains. So this was a series of sculptures and a larger installation in which urban animals are camouflaged, specific to particular neighborhoods, in this case in Istanbul. And then boom, I'm out of Istanbul. I lose 10 years of kind of artistic embedding within a social environment in which I know how to get materials. I know people, if I want, like I knew a guy who made springs, like custom springs. Not that I ever ended up using it, but like, you have these details. So I've shifted environments several times in the past, but this was kind of a big one that I'm still in the process of shifting. So I also had small children, driving lessons, visa stuff, like life things that take a lot of time, that are very interesting and engaging, like children, and that just take a lot of time, like visas. So the first time I kind of went back and was like, okay, I need to make an object for the show. I didn't have a studio. I still don't really have a studio. I went back to like cutting paper and postcards, which are two like reoccurring, easy ways to get your body and your mind. So this is a series of, I mean, I don't think, again, like, whatever. But if I look at the way that I engage with new environments, there's stepping stones along the way. And in doing this presentation, I realized what my stepping stones are, and not feeling insecure about them, and not saying this is nothing, but to be like, look, I've gone back to these core things several times in different environments in my life, and they lead to things that are more engaged. So do it. Don't say don't do it because it's not good enough or not interesting, but that's hard for me to realize. So this is a series of cut postcards, North Wales cut postcards, which was super fun to make, and I really loved it. I wouldn't like put them in an exhibition or whatever, but this is so pleasurable to be able to engage in cutting and seeing how things looked when they were mirrored and coming up with different patterns. And it's just in doing this that, and putting this up here as part of this, I was like, you know what, this was part of what happened next. And to acknowledge that as part of the process of engaging as an artist in a completely new environment. So that was a big jump from that to this, now that that slide just went forward very dramatically. So in the beginning of lockdown, when I first moved to Anglesey, there was a lot to pick apart in the physical environment of it. And I really enjoyed the process of figuring out what was happening in our zone and what was being offered. Like I had a nice kind of foraging conversation with you earlier, and I was like, yeah, I learned that too. And like understanding what elder trees were and making elderflower champagne, and like seeing what materials are there, and learning how to see what materials are interesting, which looks very different than hardware districts when there are like displays of materials. But there are displays of materials inside of our house and outside of our house too, but it takes time to figure out what language they're speaking and who they're speaking to and what their seasons are and what cycles they're engaged with and how that interacts with your own life cycles. So I'm in the middle of that at the moment, which is why it was very exciting to be invited to be like an artist working with the land, because that was a big jump for me. But I realized that everything that I was doing in my life and starting to do as an artist had to do with my surroundings, which is what I do as an artist always, is engage with the materials that are surrounding me, but to say, oh, actually, yeah, that actually is the land. And I've been deeply embedded in our very little bubble of land around Cyd-fyw on Anglesey, and that's all I've been doing for the last year and a half. And different outputs can be framed in different ways, and they can like appear in an exhibition or appear in a wild garlic pesto sauce jar, and they can appear through conversation, they can appear through observing a small patch of grass over the course of 2 years. But that core engagement is what is the source of that. And I've never committed to being in a place like foreseeably for the rest of my life, which is what I've done. I don't plan to move ever unless something happens. So that also you view your beginnings in a different way when you know you're planning for 30 years, 40 years. So there's parts of my practice in the past where I rushed because I knew I only had probably 5 years and then something else, or and lockdown, well, it magnified things and slowed down things and stopped things and sped things up in a very complicated way. But the third lockdown, when I stopped trying to work, whatever that meant, and it was winter, and I played with my young children for weeks at a time. I didn't think I was getting anything done, but then like 3 eventual artworks that were inspired by being where we were and hanging out with children came out of it without it being children's projects, but my girls were deeply involved in it. So that has been a completely new way of thinking about making work. Because I do projects for them and with them, but I didn't know until that third lockdown that you could be with them and then an artwork could come out that wasn't like, not that you designed something for them or did something for them in a way. So this was a series, well, I've never really thought about photography as something that would be an output. It was like I would make something and then figure out how to present it through a photograph. But I've never really thought about the relationship between the performative aspect of making something, the physical object that you make, and then the remnant, which is a photograph or a video. And I'm still not quite sure, because I think the most interesting part of this was actually doing it still. I still have that addiction and focus on making and doing and being. But then the photographs are what it is. But the photographs are not a documentation of what happened. So I'm still figuring that out as well. So this was a series of photographs. Oh, there we go. About a big chunk of ice that I froze in our freezer of pond water from our pond, and then returned it to the pond and watched it melt over about a 12-hour period. I think the last bit melted as it was getting dark, so I don't think I saw it actually disappear, but I was pretty close. So this was my first kind of foray into, I mean, this isn't documentation. I created images of something that I made in a place. So I'm not completely fluent at explaining this how I would like to, but I was really happy with the project, about the performative aspect of it, about the making, about the mold making, about the ice, and about the photographs. So there's a key here. This is still like a midway sort of thing, and I have 10 minutes left. Did I put the other ice melting in here? I can't go forward or back. Oh. Oh yeah, there we go. Thank you. Okay. I did do the other one. Okay, so yeah, this is good. I think this is the last one. I timed it all right, man. Great. So I was doing a lot of online things, a lot of trying to recreate, create, and illuminate real experiences for a virtual audience for about 18 months. It was a big focus. I was organizing an exhibition with about 111 people that was happening, but there was no audience. So I tried to approach that as creatively as possible with stop motion, time-lapse photography, live streaming tours. Like I experimented a lot with very little experience, but it was really good because you just had to do it, and it was bad, but then it got better. And that's not how I work. So it was good for me. But I did really see the value and the interest in this long form live streaming, in which you created an experience that existed for 24 hours, 48 hours of a live stream, like long, that you didn't gather and sit to watch it as you would a TV program or a film, but it would be a layer supplementing your life that you would check in on. It was something in which you kind of accessed when and if you wanted to. The surprise was that some people had it on for the whole day, not that they were watching it, which kind of brought me into sound in a different way. So they would have the screen. This was a 48-hour live streaming ice melt piece, very slow. Very slow. I mean, there was no wind even that day, so it did not even melt at the end of 48 hours. But the actions that were happening around it was part of this layer of sound that, I mean, it wasn't a huge audience, but it went all over the world. Like the seagulls of Carnarvon and the people who were there randomly, and the nighttime sounds added a layer, added like a sonic layer and something to access for about 100 people in very different sonic atmospheres in very different places in their own environment, without them like, okay, I'm sitting down to watch this for 48 hours. No. But I was surprised at the number of people who just kind of had this with them for this period of time. So this is like a whole new genre, but like a new medium, which I'm just kind of starting to figure out, because I'm like, I don't go out of my house, out of my zone much. Like I moved to the village pretty much during lockdown. So as a family, we figured out how to be there without going more than 5 miles quite happily. So I think this is kind of a precedent for the rest of our lives, like quite happily as a choice. So ways to share layers of that and experiences with that and experiences with the engagement that we have with our place in a meaningful way and in a very specific way without being narrative about it, like it's what I want to work with.